and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa. For this first episode, I'm very excited to share with you a conversation I had with artist Trinh Mai. Now, I first met Trinh and saw her work last year at an open studio tour of the Artist Odyssey Studios, and I was immediately drawn to it. It was just so full of love, compassion, just genuine emotion, and I was completely blown away. Trinh's art incorporates painting, drawing, sculpture, even photography, and she uses different media and combinations of media to look at, to reimagine, as she puts it, aspects of her life, her relationships, her family history, in a way that is both highly personal, but communicates something universal, something that certainly I found resonant. So I was thrilled to be able to sit down and talk with her, and in just a minute we'll hear that. First thing, though, I wanted to just take a quick moment to introduce myself and the show. I am a photographer and writer based in San Diego, California, and what this show is all about is, well, what I've found is that the most interesting conversations I ever have are with artists, and more than just being interesting, talking to artists about their work, about their perspective, how they think about the world. It's really helpful in being able to put their work into context. And I think that for a lot of people, art can have this sort of aura of impenetrability, like it's something that's just too hard to understand, and that's a shame because it ends up putting people off. But I don't think it has to be that way, that sometimes all you need is just a little bit of a way in, and then a whole new world can open up to you. At least that's how it's been for me, and so I hope by sharing these conversations with you, maybe you'll find your way in as well. Now, some of you might be wondering about the title of the show, Keep the Channel Open, and this comes from a passage I ran across a while back, something that for me was really comforting. See, like a lot of artists, I can get a little down on my work, feeling like it's not getting anywhere, especially when the rejection letters are piling up. And I was in the middle of one of those down times when I found this bit from a book called Martha, The Life and Work of Martha Graham by Agnes de Mille. So Agnes de Mille was a famous choreographer starting back in the early 40s. She choreographed the ballet Rodeo, the Aaron Copland ballet, and also early on the original production of Oklahoma. And Martha Graham was just a giant in the world of dance, also a dancer and choreographer. A lot of people considered her to be the Picasso of dance for her influence in developing modern dance. Anyway, the quote goes like this. The greatest thing she ever said to me was in 1943, after the opening of Oklahoma, when suddenly I had unexpected, flamboyant success for a work I thought was only fairly good, after years of neglect for work I thought was fine. I was bewildered and worried that my entire scale of values was untrustworthy. I talked to Martha. I remember the conversation well. It was in a Schrafft's restaurant over a soda. I confessed that I had a burning desire to be excellent, but no faith that I could be. And Martha said to me very quietly, there is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there's only one of you in all time, this expression is unique, and if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium, and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours, clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep yourself open and aware to the urges that motivate you. Keep the channel open. As for you, Agnes, you have a peculiar and unusual gift, and you have so far used about 1/3 of your talent. But, I said, when I see my work, I take for granted what other people value in it. I see only its ineptitude, inorganic flaws, and crudities. I am not pleased or satisfied. No artist is pleased. But then is there no satisfaction? No satisfaction whatever at any time, she cried out passionately. There is only a queer, divine dissatisfaction, a blessed unrest that keeps us marching and makes us more alive than the others. All right, so there it is. Keep the channel open. Not always the easiest thing to do, especially for me. Just remember it. Keep the channel open. All right, so let's get to my talk with Trinh Mai. Just so you know, we reference a few different bodies of work in the conversation, particularly two of them. One is a series of sculptures entitled Bone of My Bone from 2014, which I'll just read the statement from her website here. It goes, This spring has been a time of healing and growth, and while we fought alongside my beloved friend Kelly during her battle with cancer, I too found myself healing beside her. Inspired by the tremendous love and support shrouded upon her by the community, I was reminded of our need to heal and the importance in healing together. These bones have been crafted with fragments of tree branches and found string, which I have collected during my walks in nature, the place where I most often find my own healing. The strings bind the broken bones, looking to mend that which has been fractured by our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual struggles. And then the other body of work that we mentioned a few times was an installation called Quiet from last year, 2015. This was a series of ink transfers on white sashes, portraits, and I'll read part of the statement for that work as well. It goes, one of the funeral rituals in Vietnamese tradition is for the family members to wear white sashes upon their heads to signify their relationship to the departed. I have recreated these sashes to honor the lives of our mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles, daughters and sons who were lost during the war. This piece was originally inspired by a collection of letters that I discovered at UCI Libraries, Orange County, and Southeast Asian Archive Center, letters that were written by family members, pleading for help to find their loved ones who went missing during the escape. Each portrait is raised up in respect for those who did not survive to see the new shores, and upon them I have typed excerpts from these letters, as well as my own musings to them. You can find galleries of both of those bodies of work on her website, trinmai.com, and I'll include links to both of those in the show notes. Now, here's my conversation with Trinh Mai. All right. So I was really excited to talk to you. So we met at one of the Artist Odyssey open studio things. When was that? Like I don't know, last year sometime?
Yeah,
maybe
about a year ago.
Yeah, something like that.
I lose track of time.
Yeah, me too. But, you know, one of the things that really struck me when I got to see your work that day was just how, like if I was going to sum it up in one word, it would be empathy. That when I looked at all the stuff that you were showing that day, and then recently I also got to see the Artist Odyssey short documentary that they did about you, and that just seems to really be so present in all of the different work that you've done. And you do a lot of different kinds of work, both in medium but also in sort of theme and subject matter. So I guess what I want to talk to you about first is just sort of where that impulse comes from for you.
Oh, it comes from everywhere. It's I've heard artists saying that they have, painter's block, or writers saying they have writer's block, and my issue is that I am so inspired by everything. Just driving down the 15 today, it's overcast and there's like a slight haze, and I was just like so overwhelmed with the beauty in this world we live in. I think that's one of the things that really moves me in my work, is like finding that beauty, because it's everywhere. I mean, it's not, I really don't have to find it, but just kind of taking it in, because life is it can be so difficult. And so for me, finding the beauty and being like inspired by that thing, whether it's this physical beauty of a landscape, or like I spent some time with my friend yesterday and our godson, and just seeing how she's raised this little boy and how difficult that is to do, but watching her raise this child, that is so beautiful to me. We were college friends, so we were completely lost, and now she's helping this young boy find his way, navigate his way through life. Finding beauty is what I do in my work. And when you talked about empathy, that also comes in striving to find the goodness in a bad situation, or a trial that I'm going through, or someone else is going through, because I think that's where hope comes from, is that being able to see and really believe that things will be better, and that all this, and I am a strong believer in that everything that happens to me or for me or because of me or whatever it is, it's all for my own good. No matter how difficult the situation is, I know that these struggles are to build my character. It's to test my patience. It's to teach me forgiveness, or just to strengthen my faith. And that's what really drives me, Mike, is my faith. And not just faith in God. And this isn't a religious thing. And a lot of times I think people, and I was really, in college, I was kind of, I would be kind of, my work wasn't taken as seriously, I don't think, by some people because of my openness about faith. And then again, once I started painting and showing, there were some gallery owners that wouldn't want to put my statements up. And the statements for me is a huge part of the work and my process. So I'm sharing that too. And I mean, viewers don't have to read it, but it's available to them because some people want to know.
Well, it provides a lot of context, right?
Yes, yeah.
It provides a framework for understanding what it is that you're trying to communicate.
Yeah, yeah.
And it really seems like with your work in particular that you are, it's not just, not that there would be anything wrong with something being purely aesthetic, but that your work really is trying to communicate something.
Yeah, yeah. I want to tell these stories, and the stories that inspire me, and my own stories, and stories that I'm curious about, maybe that I don't quite know yet. But yeah, I think the faith is what really drives me, and just believing that belief in something better, that belief that I can be better, that belief that somebody can be healed, that we all can be healed, because that's like a major component of being human, is that need to heal. We've all suffered through afflictions of some sort, whether it's emotional or physical or spiritual. I've suffered through all those things. Yeah. And so and then having that faith in other people too, because often as artists, we feel like we're doing it ourselves. When we start a project, it's like, and then I think that for me, there's like a sense of control that I have. So it's hard for me to let people in to be involved, in my process. Although these past couple of years, I've been really learning and really enjoying partnering with other people, and just really collaborating with people. I've really been enjoying that. But before, I always thought it was like up to me, and it really was when I started painting, because it's like, if I never made another painting in my life, like, who would really care? Like, would anybody care? My husband might care, my mom might care, but would anybody notice? No, they might, maybe somebody might think, what happened to her? Is she still making work? But nobody really cares. So the work it's important for me to make these things so that I can live, really, to continue my life and to explore those things that I hold dear to me, and honor those things that are important to me, and just search for whatever it is, whatever it is that I need to know about or I need to express. It's just life, and paint or charcoal or whatever I'm using just happens to be my language at the time, right? So I'm telling these stories, and so that's why my work, going back to your question about like how I'm using so many different mediums and themes, the themes change because I change, and we're constantly evolving, and so I'll allow the inspiration to really take over. And that's an issue I have, is I have so many projects started at like so many. And I mean, like, spanning all different mediums, but like, I don't really consider myself a writer, but I have to write to kind of make sense of things. I kind of do it hand in hand. So my sketchbook is mostly writing. I'll start with an idea, and then I'll kind of take some notes and write a little bit about it, and then I'll start the painting, and then the painting will reveal something to me, and then I go back to the writing and just jot down more notes, and so it happens hand in hand. It's part of the process. So I'll have like these ideas that I've started writing about, like, that I just haven't finished, and they're so important to me, like this tooth extraction. Okay, that was like the latest big deal for me, because I was like, first of all, I felt like, oh my God, I'm getting old. Seriously, my tooth cannot handle Korean barbecue. Like, how is it was like, and I went to the dentist. I got the tooth pulled, and as I'm sitting in my chair, I have two friends, Jenny Doe and Kelly Clark. They're both artists. They're both amazing women, very very accomplished, and I've known them for years, since San Jose State. And Kelly I studied with throughout my time there, and then Jenny, actually, she offered me my first show. She invited me to show for the very first time, and that show was what set the momentum. When I sold pieces, being a student at that time, I could not believe that other people found value in my work.
Yeah, well, that's a tough thing for everybody, especially when you're first starting out, right?
Yeah,
I go through that all the time with myself, my own work. But so you mentioned San Jose State.
Yes, San Jose State.
And that's where you went to school. Are you originally from up north, or are you?
Yeah, I'm from the Bay Area.
Okay.
So I was born in Pennsylvania. That's where my parents had, after the war, they had arrived there in 1975.
Okay.
So they lived in refugee camps from in Guam, in the Philippines, and then eventually ended up in Harrisburg.
Okay.
And that's where I was born. And then I went to school all over the Bay Area. So as northern as Pleasanton, and then South San Jose. So I've lived in over 40 homes in my entire life.
Wow, that's a lot. I lived around a lot.
And I'm not an Army brat. It's insane. But so I'm from the Bay Area. Go Warriors.
Yeah. So, one of the things that strikes me about the Bay, I didn't know that you were from up there. I'm sort of in that direction myself. I grew up outside of Monterey.
Oh, okay.
But one of the things that's always struck me, when I was a kid, we went up to the city a lot, and we would go to San Jose to shop. We would go, other places in the Bay, because that's sort of like the cultural hub of that part of Northern California, right? But one of the things that, to me, like the energy up in the Bay Area is so different from where I grew up, and it's definitely different from Southern California, where we are now. But so like where I grew up was sort of a small town, rural, and like almost completely white area. But one of the things that always struck me visiting the Bay was that there's this sort of mingling of so many different cultures. You have so many different immigrant groups that have come through San Francisco, and some settled there. Was that something that you felt part of your experience growing up, or?
I honestly didn't pay attention to that kind of stuff. Like I was very much alone a lot of the time. Even growing up, like I remember living, this is during middle school or elementary school through high school. We lived in Pleasanton, and we'd always have to drive to Oakland to have dim sum. It was like the best dim sum, and my dad wouldn't have it anywhere else, so we'd drive all the way to Oakland. And I remember going to San Jose to go grocery shopping, at the Vietnamese supermarkets. But I don't remember being like as involved, even in college. I think when I discovered painting, that's when I really kind of learned how to be by myself, really, because I remember always needing a lot of people around to, to feel like important or to feel part of something. But once I discovered my work, I just didn't even pay attention. My art world was in that studio at San Jose State.
And how did that come about? Like you discovered your work. That's nuts. I mean, everybody sort of comes at it in a different way, sort of discovers it in a different way. Was that, it kind of sounds like the way you're talking about it is that maybe this is something that you came to a little later rather than having grown up artistic? Is that? I grew up very, very artistic. Okay. Like I always had my art stuff with me. And one of the first gifts that I really remember in childhood was this blue plastic suitcase, and it came with like a how to draw book, papers, watercolors, pencils, and it made me feel like a legit artist. And I would carry that thing around. But I always had scratch paper, and even like in fourth grade, I was trying to sell my work, and I went to a Catholic school, so Sister Barbara was like always reprimanding me because I was always trying to sell my drawings, for like a quarter each, But I was always very creative, and I was a latchkey kid, so I'd come home from school, take that hidden key since fourth grade, and I would be home by myself until like 7 o'clock when my parents would come home from work. And that was every day for years, throughout high school. So I was always trying to keep myself busy. Or I'd be outside collecting rocks or whatever it was. But it wasn't, when I went to college, in high school, I didn't really take art seriously. I just kind of doodle. I'd make like posters for like football games and stuff. And, but in my first 2 or 3 years of college, I took drawing classes here and there, but I think I was still really lost. Like I didn't really find my voice in art or anything. I took beginning drawing, didn't want to be drawing cylinders and cubes and spheres, and just got bored and was like, what am I learning here? Just like totally arrogant. And then I realized later on that what it did was it taught me to see. And so I love studies now, but it wasn't until my junior year in college that I took my first painting class with Tony May, and it was acrylic on paper. And oh my gosh, just the feeling of that paint on paper, that in itself was so cathartic. Just that quality, of just this thick stuff. And I'm, and that's what we were doing in beginning painting, was painting spheres and objects. But I loved it. It just felt different from drawing. And then after that, I took the intermediate painting course, which was Robert Carrito was my instructor, and for the first class, he was like, okay, this is like the first painting class. He says, just start painting. Don't think about it. You'll figure it out later what you're doing. Begin. And I was like, what? And that's when I started painting abstract. And so I was just having so much fun with the color, and we were working with oil on canvas. So that was like my first time. And just the viscosity of the paint, and being able to not be wrong, because we weren't supposed to be drawing anything or painting anything specific. He said, find it later. And so I wanted to search, and I just got lost in that color. And I found that abstract work was so purely like spiritual. And I didn't know that that's what it was at that time. I was just thinking, oh my gosh, the fact that I can just let go and paint and create this thing. So from the beginning, it started off being this, it was already a search for me. That's how I was trained, to just find it later on. Yeah. And just let go. And that was, it's pivotal to my growth as an artist, and just the beginning, where you're taught that it can't be wrong. Just work and find yourself.
that seems like a really valuable perspective.
So valuable.
I never went to art school, but hearing other people talk about it, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily an approach that you always get in an art school setting. So, yeah. It's interesting too to hear you talk about, like, in both of those painting media, to hear the thing that you're really, like, your eyes kind of light up when you're talking about the physical qualities of the paint itself. And that's something that really strikes me about your work, is that it is all very tactile, that whether it's the more straight paintings, or you have the pieces where, like, you've stitched into the painting, or the sculptural pieces with the sticks that you've wrapped with string and things like that they all, there's a real sense of the piece having been worked with hands, like that there's a sense of somebody has touched this, which isn't necessarily, especially for, like, myself as a photographer, and most of the people that I know are photographers, that's, like, for most of us, isn't really a thing, for, like, that real sense of the artist's hand isn't necessarily there for everybody. But in your work, that's a thing. And I mean, is that something that's, it seems like it must be part of your process, something that's important to you.
Yeah, I have to feel it with my hands. I have a hard time having a tool in between it. Paint brushes are the closest I get, even with anything, like even sports. Like, I'm actually pretty good at football and basketball, but anything else, like involving something in between the ball, like tennis, hockey, baseball, like, I'm horrible at. I have to hold that thing to understand it. And even in my paintings, I'll put on gloves, and sometimes I'm just working with my hands, because I want to move that paint around. I want to feel it underneath my fingertips and move it around. And thank you for saying that it feels like these things have been touched, because it's important for my process just to understand it and to, be able to craft something. I think there's such, I don't know if there's even a line between, like, fine art and craft. It's that human hand in something. And I think that can be felt as well as seen. Sometimes it can't be seen, but felt. And then, with some work that I've seen. But I like that. It's like leaving this human imprint in it, just being able to work directly onto it. And I like all the messy stuff, like, the charcoal. That's why I love charcoal so much, is it's so messy and, like, pastel, and seeing the fingerprints left on there, just from moving and, rubbing the chalk on the paper, and just feeling that the tooth of the paper and, the scratching of the charcoal. It's like, it's all the senses, just, the touch, the smell of it, of oil paint, the sound that it makes, like a dry brush on canvas. I mean, there's such, I love it all. Like, I love it all. It's it's just all my senses being involved. And even taste, actually. I've actually accidentally drank, like, my watercolor rinsing water, just not paying attention. And, so yeah, tasting, I suppose. And then, I also use other materials that are like food materials. So I'm actually physically tasting, like, I've used salt in my work and sugar in my work, and I've tasted it, and used it in the work as well. Like, if it holds a symbolic meaning, or if it makes sense to the work. Yeah. So.
One of the other things about your work, and I guess this would be sort of also going back sort of your history as an artist, that like, one of the really strong themes that you, or subjects, I guess, that you work with, like, a lot of your different projects have focused on the Vietnamese community and on the experience of that community and the effect that the war had there and here. A lot of that is, it's clearly something that is really important to you. And what I wonder is, like, is that something that you always sort of knew you were going to do art about, or is it something that you kind of had to get to?
While in school, I was encouraged to explore that. Mm-hmm. I was encouraged when I was taking advanced painting. Rupert Garcia did a lot of, he's an amazing artist, and he does a lot of like Chicano, very politically motivated art. Mm-hmm. And he was one of my mentors there, and he was like, so who are you as a Vietnamese-American, and what do you know about your history? And you should explore that.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't ready, and I never did. And it wasn't until I moved. It wasn't until my great aunt had passed when I found all those photos and thought. And what struck me was that when I was in her apartment gathering her photos, she had them all organized. She was, and in the back of every photo, she had written who's in the photo, where they were at, the date, what they were doing there. And any significant anything, like little notes. And every photo was documented. And I thought, she really wanted to leave this story behind. It was important for her. And I don't think she wrote it for some reason, I don't feel like she wrote it to remember it. I feel like she wrote it for whoever it was that was going to see these photos. Mm-hmm. And for some reason. And I thought, I need to share these. Mm-hmm. So that's when it really started. And that was in 2011. So that was, I graduated in 2004. So it took me like 7 years. I think I did one painting before that, when I had learned about, when my mom had told me about she and her family getting on a boat and just the boat breaking down in the middle of the ocean. Mm-hmm. I did one painting, and that was in 2003. And then I just kind of put it aside because I didn't know what to do with it. Mm-hmm. And I ended up finishing it, but when I really started focusing on the work about like my family history, then that wasn't until later. And then I started with only 10 of those little family tree pieces, and I ended up with 63 of them, a little more, I think, because I just couldn't stop. I was like, I'm just going to mess around with these. And it was like my first time experimenting with resin. My first time doing anything like that. It was also new, and using and incorporating family photos. And I guess I just went all out. Like, let's just go for it. And I could not stop because there were so many beautiful images of these like precious children, and just the way that my great grandmother is holding her kids, and just the life back then, and how simple they were, and how in so many of the photos they're barefoot, and there's something so beautiful about that. Like, they're barefoot on their front porch in Vietnam, black and white, So that's when it really started. And then through that, all these conversations began. And I wasn't making this work to search for anything other than it was just to share. And then through that, the search began. So my grandmother would, for example, there's just one piece I did. It's my great-grandmother and grandfather holding their children. And I had taken some tree bark and kind of like made a little house and then coated it with resin. And I was so proud of it because I was like, this is so cool. Like, resin keeps anything. It like preserves anything. So I showed my grandmother. And she saw that little house, and she told me the story about how when she was growing up, she lived next door to a church. And because of that, like, they'd always find abandoned babies on their front porch because the mothers must have thought, oh, they'll be safe here. They're next to a church. And it happened so frequently that my great-grandparents had to build a makeshift shack in their backyard to house the children because they couldn't fit them all in their house.
Wow.
And my grandmother was in charge of feeding the babies. And then on the weekends, they would take them up to the city. This is when they lived in Vietnam, where my grandmother was born. But they would have to drive them up to the city where there was an orphanage and deliver all these babies. And that's what would happen on the weekends.
Wow.
And nobody knew about this story, Mike. How can nobody in the family know about this story? It's so important. It just shows, the heart that my great-grandparents had. And I knew my great-grandmother, but, not very well. And it just shows their love for humanity. And that's why... And then I'm able to understand why my grandmother loved people so much, and why she was the way she was, and why my mom is so loving, and she's always doing charity work, and why I'm so sensitive maybe to other people's struggles. And it's all passed down, and it helps me understand who I am by learning these stories. And so that story came about from this little piece, this little 4 by 5 inch little piece. And that was happening so often. There's another image that I have of my auntie holding this little doll, and it was just such a sweet photo of her because she's so proud of this doll. She's got this huge smile. And I did a little piece and showed her, and she told me about the doll and how my grandfather, he was a language arts teacher in Vietnam, but he used to travel to to the States. He used to travel to America, and during one of his trips, he brought home that doll for her. And it was so special to her. And I'm like, so wait, grandfather had been to America even before the fall of Saigon? I didn't know that. Yeah. I thought it was like a fresh new land, like that I don't know. And those things would have never been told if it wasn't for the art. So it's just been remarkable the way it's all kind of it comes together.
It's pretty amazing. There's so much of like in anybody's family, really, right? Like there are so many stories like that where, and especially when you start losing people in your family, you come to realize how little you might actually know them. Is something that I think about a lot, especially given the direction that I have taken with my work so far. But one of the things that I think about with and this relates to my work, but also relates to your work a lot, is that we're both working in a space where we're using our personal histories and our family histories. And so that makes it extremely specific and personal, right? But it's also, these stories that you have, they're highly specific, but they're very relatable. And you do them in a way that makes, these connections that you're talking about are universal. That's a real hard thing to do, I think.
I hope that. I hope for that. And I don't think it's anything I can plan. It's nothing I mean to do, and it surprises me when non-Vietnamese connect with it. And I know that a lot of us have mourned a loss. A lot of us, we have our own families. I don't tend to think that far ahead about who will connect with the work or how it'll read, unless I'm doing something specific like being commissioned for something, or
but
of course.
It's one of those things where that's, for me anyway, that's that point of connection is sort of what it's all about.
Yeah.
And so that's something, where you talked about this a bit in the Artist Odyssey documentary, that in many of these things that you're doing, you're using their stories that you have a connection to, but they're not necessarily your story. and that can be a tricky thing to sort of navigate. And can you talk a little bit about that and how you've dealt with that? And because these things, you know, I can say for myself, I mean, I can't speak for anybody else's reaction, but seeing your work, there is so much that I can connect with, even though I'm not Vietnamese and I don't know any of those people. And so those stories are they're relatable just as stories in themselves, and they're obviously highly meaningful to the people that were involved in them. But they're also things that just as an audience member with no connection, we can still find something very resonant.
Thank you. And I think when I do my work that tells someone else's story, it's also my story. Like if I connect so closely with their story, I become a part of that story. I'm moved by that story, and I'm inspired by that story, and I feel for them. I'm empathizing, and I think the work has really placed me into this really profound space of compassion. And I think a lot of people, or I think compassion is this word that's kind of used like, you know, it's a virtue, you know, like this kind of light thing. I hear it used a lot, like compassion, but compassion is a very heavy thing. And when I'm inspired by a story, most of the time it's the story of the underdog, right? It starts with somebody really struggling through something, and they're coming out victorious through all that struggle, and they've persevered, and they believe in their strength. Maybe not. Maybe they're doubting their strength, but then the community gets behind them, and they're like, no, like, you are a warrior. That moves me. And so when I find myself really thinking about these people, I'm like, well, you know, I'm fighting right alongside them, or I'm walking with them, or I understand what they're going through, or I've been there. And so in that, and I mean, when we tell someone else's story, there's a different kind of respect. Like, you can tell your story any way you want, but when you're telling someone else's story, there's a certain reverence, you know, that I have. There's more respect. You know, I really want to respect the work. Like, I spent all of 2014 pretty much making artwork about Kelly's healing. And every time I made a piece, I had to ask her for permission. Like, I have this idea and I need to do it. Do I have your permission? And she was like, this is our story. But I felt like every time I started something new, I had to ask her about it.